The reality is that I know war very, very well. I have witnessed time and time again the way that it can destroy a person's soul, the way that an individual ends up utterly shredded by the lack of comprehension when it comes to how to process their emotions, how to cope with the physical destruction of everything that they knew to be real, and how it claws at their mental psyche at every single step of the way. And in most cases, it even steals away any shred of dignity that may remain. I just got back from Raqqa, city in Syria that had just been liberated by the Syrian Democratic Forces. That is the force that is being backed by the US-led coalition. And it was liberated from ISIS. And despite all of the different war zones that I've been to, there was something that was especially jarring about Raqqa. Every other place that I've been to, amid the destruction and the devastation, you would always find little bits of color, whether it was a child's shoe or a toy or a scrap of a notebook. There would be a hint of the lives that used to exist there, of the happiness that once existed within these walls. And in Raqqa, there was nothing. It was gray. And it was impossible to imagine how anyone could have quite possibly survived. And then I met a family who did at one of the refugee camps. And Najah, she was the mother, and she had 7 children. And she was telling us about how she had to send out her 9-year-old daughter while they were under siege to go and get supplies for them. Her 9-year-old daughter would go out and siphon with a hose fuel from wrecked out cars so that she could bake bread for the rest of them. And they hid underground in the darkness in the final days of the battle for Raqqa. Because they had tried to flee time and time again, they would try to run away. And at every single occasion, they described how ISIS would shoot at them and they would be forced back, or even stop them and hold a gun to their heads. In fact, the little 5-year-old could easily mimic the way that ISIS would say, "Stay back, we're going to shoot you." And so the 9-year-old went out. And one day, the 9-year-old managed to find a little piece of meat. She begged it off of an ISIS fighter. And it was so small, it would fit in the palm of your hand. And this was to feed a family of 9. And the other children were so excited. You would think that they had just seen the most marvelous gift they could possibly imagine. That's how deprived they were in those moments, in those final moments. And the reason why Najah had to send out her 9-year-old was because she couldn't send out her 17-year-old son. ISIS was deliberately conscripting men. She couldn't send out her 15-year-old daughter because ISIS was trying to get as many brides as possible. And they had, in fact, already come after her daughter. But she had somehow found the courage to grab a knife from the kitchen and chase this fighter out of her house. But the 15-year-old had to stay hidden. And so she sent out her 9-year-old. Now, of course, her entire family were incredibly relieved to have survived. But now they were living in a refugee camp. And they literally had nothing. Najah actually coincidentally messaged me a few days ago. And she said, Arwa, it's been about a week since you've been here. People have been seeing the reporting about Raqqa. We know that there's been a lot of journalists. What's going on? Is anyone going to help us? What do we do? Doesn't the world care about what's happening? I could not respond to those questions because if I were to try to say something reassuring, that would probably be a lie. And I could not tell her the truth, that most people turn away when they see stories from Syria, that there is an apathy when it comes to a lot of the war zones that are currently out there, and that politicians and global leaders and the people that could actually impact her life probably don't really understand it and maybe even don't care. So I had to say nothing. And that's not the first time we, as journalists, receive these kinds of questions from these kinds of individuals that have already been through more than we can ever possibly imagine. And so most mornings, most days, in fact, I do think that maybe the world is better off if our planet was just hit by an asteroid. Because for us as journalists, we really do feel, especially today, that a lot of this reporting that we're doing, especially when it comes to the human stories, to the people that are suffering because of decisions over which they have no control, all of that is happening in a dark void, in a dark abyss. But then I remember the story of a little boy who taught me one of the most valuable lessons I have ever learned throughout my career. This little boy's name was Yusuf. It was Iraq, it was 2007, and back then, Iraq too was no longer really in the headlines, it was no longer really in the spotlight. People were turning away when they heard stories about Iraq. Yusuf came to our office, our CNN Baghdad bureau, and he had been burnt. Unknown masked men had doused him in gasoline and set him on fire. He was just 5 years old. By the time he got into our office, his face had hardened into this mask of scar tissue. He couldn't open his mouth, and he sat in our Baghdad bureau eating rice, but he had to take one grain at a time and just shove it between his lips. He was so angry, but he didn't know how to process these emotions. He was just 5 years old, and so all you could do to really understand how tormented this child was look in his eyes. And he was lashing out at his sister, and his parents didn't know what to do. And all we could do for them at that point was say, look, we can try to tell your story, but we don't know what's going to happen. We told Yusuf's story, and the response was amazing. I mean, it came from all over the world. People wanted to help. It transcended ethnicity, nationality, religion, all sorts of boundaries. People came together to help this little boy, and an organization in Los Angeles ended up agreeing to take on the case. CNN viewers donated hundreds of thousands of dollars to help this family out. My best moment of my career was the moment when I could pick up the phone and tell his parents, your little boy is going to get help. And I traveled with them to Los Angeles, and I remember seeing Yusuf at the beach, and he was seeing the ocean for the first time. And he ran towards it screaming and laughing, and I looked over at his parents, and they were crying because it was the first time they'd heard their son laugh in a year. What that story taught me was that the kindness and compassion of strangers exists, and we may not always see it every day. But just the power of caring and then of doing something about it, even if it's a small donation to one little boy, has such a massive, profound impact. Yusuf today not only wants to be a doctor to help others the way that he has been helped, he doesn't remember the attack anymore. 10 years on, this 15-year-old boy's life, his first memories of life, are not defined by violence. They are defined by the kindness and compassion that he saw afterwards. And it doesn't need to be large change that can impact a person's life. How we react to one another in sometimes the worst of situations can have a lasting impact on our psyche. For myself personally, about a year ago to date, I was in Mosul. I was embedded with the Iraqi counterterrorism force with my cameraman, and we were going in as they were part of their first push to try to retake Mosul from ISIS. And our unit, our convoy, ended up being ambushed, and a suicide car bomb came in and took out the back vehicle of the convoy. The first vehicle went up in this massive ball of flames, and we were trapped. And we ended up seeking shelter in the middle of all of this madness in civilian homes. And we were in one house, and the front line was pretty much the wall of the house. The women and children were hiding in the back corner. The courtyard of the house was filled with wounded soldiers and streaked with blood. And in the middle of all of this, the homeowner makes fried eggs for us and for the soldiers, because despite it all, we were their guests. And that was the only way that they could also hold on to their humanity and their dignity. But for me, that whole nightmare of an ordeal that I was fortunate enough to have only last for 24 hours was not defined by the fear that I experienced. It was defined by the kindness that I saw. We know that we cannot stop the wars, but we can help to mitigate the consequences of it on an individual, if not directly alter them. Small actions in ways that we react to one another, especially people that have suffered violence and trauma, has a profound impact, whether it's a small moment that just lasts for a day or even less, or whether it's one that can impact them over and over again over the course of a lifetime. I remember about 2 years ago during the big flood of refugees to Europe, I was in Hungary covering the refugee crisis. And there was that one day when the refugees who had been waiting at the Budapest train station decided, that's it, we're going to walk. These are individuals who had not only seen the worst of the suffering in their own countries, the worst of the violence possibly imaginable, had just crossed the Mediterranean, risking their lives, risking their children's lives, and then quite literally carried their children for weeks and suffered every single humiliation you could possibly imagine along every step of the route. And as they walked, and we were broadcasting live, as were other networks, about 2 hours into this walk, all of a sudden people began showing up with strollers. The refugees that were around us in that moment were so overwhelmed at that little small gesture that they said that they would never forget it, and I believe them when they say that. I believe that that is going to be one of the key points of a story that they then tell their children. What I now know is that governments will continue to fail. They will fail, but we do not need to fail each other. There are things that we can do on a small scale every single day. We choose how we react to one another. We cannot turn away from a news story because it might be disturbing. We can actually go out and learn more about the root causes of what is happening and understand a bit more about what actually needs to be done to prevent it. We can educate our children about what's happening in the world around them, teach them not to be afraid of someone because they may perceive them or misperceive them as being different. We can teach our children, we can teach ourselves and oblige ourselves to go out and speak to somebody who might be the new child or the new family in town. There are little things we can do every single day that have an immense and enormous power. Thank you.